Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. 6 moving trucks blocked my driveway the morning my own daughter sold my home of a $1.4 million for sale sign hammered into the lawn I'd mowed for 30 years. A judge I had never met had ruled me mentally incompetent. My daughter handed me an empty suitcase and said, "One suitcase, Dad. That's what the judge allows." I did not argue. I did not beg.
I packed that suitcase myself because I spent 34 years investigating crashes for the National Transportation Safety Board, and I recognize a staged accident when I'm standing inside one. They had spent 4 months proving I was losing my mind. By the time this story ends, they would learn exactly what this house remembers. My name is Abner Kelly, 71 years old, widower. Retired air safety investigator, 34 years, reconstructing the last 30 seconds of other people's disasters from wreckage, from cockpit voice recorders, from the small mechanical truths that survive when everything else burns. On that Saturday morning, standing on my own porch in Beaver Dam, North Carolina, I was about to reconstruct one more. The trucks came first, 6 of them, backing up my gravel driveway in a slow, deliberate line, engines idling like a funeral procession that had lost its patience. Men in matching gray polos carried out my life in numbered boxes. My son-in-law, Gavin Dillon, stood at the center of the driveway with a clipboard, directing them the way a general directs in advance, calling out room names, study, den, sunroom, as though he had memorized the house better than I had. Built my memories in it. My daughter Laurel stood beside him in a soft gray coat, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. She was not crying. She had not cried in 4 months. Not once. Not even when she told the judge I sometimes forgot my own address. She crossed the lawn toward me, holding a single empty suitcase, and the whole street went quiet enough that I could hear the hinges of the mailbox creak in the wind. "One suitcase, Dad," she said. "That's what the judge allows." If you're new here, welcome. I tell these kinds of stories because I believe the quietest people in a room are often the ones holding the most dangerous information, and I want you to stay close, because what happens at the end of this one is not what anyone standing on that lawn expected. If you've ever had to decide whether to confront the person who betrayed you the moment you found out, or hold your silence and let the proof speak for you instead, tell me in the comments which one you would choose, because by the end of today, you will know exactly which one I chose. A quick note before we go further: some details here have been adjusted for storytelling, though the truth underneath it is very real. I took the suitcase from her hands without a word. I did not look at Gavin. I did not look at the men carrying my wife's china through my own front door wrapped in nothing but bubble plastic. I looked instead at a small black light fixed high in the corner of the porch ceiling, no larger than a shirt button, blinking once every 4 seconds, patient as a heartbeat. Nobody on that lawn had ever noticed it. Nobody was supposed to. One of the movers, an older man with silver in his beard and a canvas belt worn soft from 40 years of other people's furniture, paused halfway down the porch steps with a box marked "Fragile" in my late wife's china pattern. He looked at me for a long moment, then at Laurel's back, and gave the smallest shake of his head, the kind of gesture a man makes when his hands are doing a job his conscience has already quit. I filed that away. In my old line of work, we called it a data point. I walked back into the house one final time past the boxes stacked like sandbags against a flood, and stopped at the fireplace mantel where my wife's wristwatch used to sit. It had not been there in months. I already knew where it had gone, and I already knew why, though I would not say either thing out loud that morning, not to Laurel, not to Gavin, not even to myself. I set the suitcase down on the porch unopened, and I began folding my own clothes into it with hands that did not shake, because 34 years of pulling order out of wreckage teaches a man exactly one lesson worth keeping: panic destroys evidence, and evidence was the only thing I had left that they could not take from me. "Time's tight, Abner," Gavin called out, checking his watch, not looking up. "Judge wants the property vacated by noon." I finished folding my last shirt, closed the suitcase, and looked at my daughter for what I let her believe was the last time.
Whatever she saw in my face that morning, she read it wrong. She always had, ever since the year everything between us went quiet 3 years earlier, on an afternoon that had nothing to do with courthouses or suitcases, the afternoon I gave this house something neither of them ever thought to ask about. A black box of its own. 3 years earlier, on an afternoon that had nothing to do with courthouses or suitcases, I was kneeling in a soybean field outside Hickory, North Carolina, cataloging the scattered pieces of a single-engine Cessna that had come apart at 1,100 feet. That was my life. Somebody else's worst day, laid out in a grid of numbered flags, waiting for me to tell the truth about what had killed them. My phone buzzed once in my jacket pocket. I did not answer it. Federal investigators do not stop mid-scene to take calls, not even from home, not even on a day that would later feel like the hinge my whole life turned on. I remember glancing at the screen only once, hours later, crouched beside a section of wing spar. 9:41 in the morning. One missed call. Ruby. She never called during working hours. 38 years of marriage had taught her exactly when my phone was allowed to matter, and 9:41 on a Tuesday was not one of those times. So I finished the grid. I photographed the spar fracture. I drove 2 hours home with the radio off the way I always did after a scene, letting the silence do the work of putting my thoughts back in order. The porch light was on when I pulled into the driveway, though it was not yet dark. That was the first thing wrong. Ruby turned that light off every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, a habit older than our marriage, something her own mother had taught her about not wasting what you have. I remember standing in the driveway a moment longer than I needed to, keys still in my hand, some part of me already running the numbers before I had a single fact to run them on. I found her in the kitchen, on the floor near the pantry door, one hand still curled around the handle of a cabinet, as though she had reached for something to steady herself, and the cabinet had not been enough. The coffee she'd started that morning had long since burned dry in the pot, filling the room with a smell I can still call up whole, even now, even 3 years later if I let myself. The paramedics told me later that a stroke like hers caught early might have given us months. Might have given us a chance to say the things people say when they know time has a number attached to it. She had been alone on that kitchen floor for roughly 6 hours. I have run that number so many times since that it no longer even feels like arithmetic. It feels like a verdict. I do not remember most of the funeral. I remember the folding chairs set out under a gray October sky, and I remember Laurel standing at the front of them in a black dress that had been her mother's, twisting the fabric of it between 2 fingers the way she used to when she was small and frightened of something she couldn't name. I remember thinking she looked exactly like Ruby and hating myself for thinking it, because Ruby was the one lying in the box in front of us, and I had no right to see her anywhere else that day. Laurel did not speak to me until the reception had thinned to a handful of casseroles and a room gone quiet. She found me on the back porch, where I had gone because I could not stand one more person telling me Ruby was in a better place. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she said anything at all. "You weren't there," she said. I told her I knew that. I told her I had been 2 hours away in a field doing the only work I had ever known how to do. "You're always 2 hours away," she said. Her voice had gone very flat, the way it does when a person has decided not to cry in front of you. "Mom called you. At 9:41. I checked your phone records, Dad. I checked because I needed to know if you even tried." I did not have an answer for that. Not one that would have meant anything to a 29-year-old woman standing in her mother's funeral dress, twisting the hem between her fingers, waiting for her father to explain why a missed call had been allowed to sit in his pocket for 6 hours while a woman he loved lay dying on a kitchen floor. What I wanted to say was that I had spent my entire career learning that the difference between a tragedy and a near miss is almost always a matter of minutes nobody could have bought back. What I said instead was nothing. I stood there and let her look at me the way you look at wreckage you already know the cause of. She left an hour later without saying goodbye. It would be nearly 2 years before she came to that house again on anything but a holiday, and even then, something in the room between us had gone permanently narrow, like a hallway with the furniture pushed too close to both walls. I stayed on that porch long after the last car pulled out of the driveway, until the light went the color of a bruise and the crickets started up in the field behind the house. And I made myself one promise in the dark that I did not tell a single living soul. I was never going to be 2 hours away again. Not from anything that mattered. Not ever. The house was too quiet for the first 2 weeks. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty room, but a specific engineered silence, the kind you get when a building has lost the one sound that used to fill every gap in it. A kettle going on for tea, nobody drinks anymore. A piano scale practiced half-heartedly and then abandoned. The particular rhythm of somebody else's footsteps on a staircase. I had spent 34 years listening to instruments that told the truth about what had already happened. I had never once built anything meant to tell the truth about what was still to come. That changed on a Thursday night in early November, 3 weeks after the funeral, when I sat down at my desk with a legal pad and started sketching the floor plan of my own house, like it was a crash site I hadn't visited yet. In my old work, we called this failure mode analysis. You don't wait for the second disaster to study the first one properly. You go back through every system that let you down, and you fix what you can still reach. I called a security contractor out of Asheville the next morning, a quiet, competent man named Roy, who did not ask why a 71-year-old widower wanted continuous audio and video coverage in every room of a house with no children living in it anymore. I told him I wanted redundancy. Cloud storage, time-stamped, encrypted, nothing that could be wiped by a single failed hard drive or a single bad decision made in a hurry. He nodded like it was a perfectly ordinary request, ran conduit through the attic for 3 straight days, and left me with a small black indicator light in every room no larger than a shirt button, blinking once every 4 seconds. I watched him install the last one myself, standing on a ladder in the kitchen doorway aimed at the exact spot on the floor where I had found her. I did not tell Roy that. I simply held the ladder steady and said nothing while he leveled the bracket. My neighbor across the road, a retired school teacher named Wilhelmina, saw the van in my driveway and stopped by that weekend with a casserole and a raised eyebrow. She asked if I was worried about break-ins out here so far from town. I told her something true without telling her everything true. I said a man who spent his life gathering evidence gets uncomfortable in a house that can't gather any of its own. She laughed, said that sounded like something Ruby would have found charming, and left the casserole on the counter beside a note that said, "Call if you need anything." I did not tell her the real reason because I did not fully know it myself yet. I only knew that I could not walk past that kitchen doorway one more time without something in me insisting that this house owed me a record of what happened inside it going forward for as long as I had breath left to check it. What I have never told anyone, not Roy, not Wilhelmina, not a single soul in 3 years, is that I built that system not out of suspicion of the living, but out of a debt to the dead. If I had been standing in that kitchen with a camera running, I would have known the moment Ruby went down, not 6 hours later, not from a missed call I hadn't checked in a field 2 hours away. I would have known in real time the way I know everything now, whether I want to or not. That was the deal I made with myself in the dark, and I never once stopped to ask what it might cost me to keep it. There was one drawer in my desk I did not open that November, and I still had not opened it 3 years later on the morning 6 moving trucks came up my driveway. Ruby's old cell phone sat in that drawer-screened dark corner of the case-worn pail where her thumb used to rest. It had gone dead the day I found her, and had stayed that way ever since, except for one habit I never let myself examine too closely. Once a month, on the first Sunday, I would plug it in overnight and let it charge to full before sliding it back under a stack of old engineering journals. I told myself it was respect. I told myself a great many things that November that I have since had cause to doubt. The phone held exactly one voicemail. 9:41 in the morning. The same morning, the same minute, the missed call had lit up my own screen out in that soybean field. 26 seconds long. I had looked at the file information precisely once, the length, the timestamp, nothing more. And then I had closed that drawer, the way you close a door on a room where something is burning, not because the fire will go out on its own, but because you are not ready yet to stand there and watch it. I told myself I would listen to it when I was ready. I told myself that for 3 years, the way a man tells himself he will get to a warning light on his dashboard eventually, right up until the morning the whole engine finally seizes. I charged that phone once a month, every month, without once asking myself out loud what exactly I was keeping it charged for. And in a house now wired to remember everything that happened in it, that single unopened voicemail remained the one thing I had deliberately chosen not to know. A 26-second message I still did not have the courage to hear. 3 years is a long time to keep a promise to yourself in an empty house. Long enough that the promise stops feeling like grief and starts feeling like furniture, something you walk around without noticing anymore. I had settled into a rhythm by early March. Coffee at 6, a walk down to the mailbox and back, an hour some evenings with the recordings I never watched, just to confirm the little light was still blinking the way it should. Then on the first Tuesday of that March, Laurel's car came up the driveway for the first time in almost 2 years. She arrived with a pot of soup still warm in a towel on the passenger seat, and the moment she stepped out of the car, I caught it. Ruby's perfume, the specific one my wife had worn for 30 years, the one Laurel had never touched before in her life. I did not say anything about it. I told myself it was a kindness, a daughter reaching for her mother's memory, the only way she knew how. I let her in, and I let myself be glad in a way I had not allowed myself to be glad about anything in 3 years. The Tuesday visits became a habit almost immediately. Soup or a casserole, or once a loaf of bread she swore she'd baked herself, though the bag it came wrapped in still had a grocery store label folded underneath. Gavin came along most weeks too, always cheerful, always useful, offering to help me sort through what he called the paperwork side of things. Insurance renewals, the property tax bill, a stack of mail I'd let pile up on the hall table without much interest. I let him. It seemed like exactly the kind of small mercy a man my age was supposed to accept gracefully. We went to the Saturday farmers market together, the 3 of us, the second week of March. That was where I first met a woman named Heidi Little, and heard something that would matter far more than I understood at the time. Heidi was a widow near my own age, 78, by her own cheerful accounting, out early for turnips and conversation in equal measure. She caught my sleeve at the tomato stand to tell me how well she'd settled into Summit Pines, the assisted living community she'd moved into that past fall. She said it the way people say things they've decided to be grateful for. A company had come through her house before the move, she told me, handled everything so gently, so respectfully, she hadn't had to lift a single box herself. Gentle passage, she called them. She said the young man who ran it had remembered her cat's name the whole time, and wasn't that something in this day and age? I nodded and said that did sound like something. I did not think about it again for weeks. The first strange thing happened on a Thursday 10 days later. I had a dentist appointment marked on my kitchen calendar for 2 o'clock, written in my own hand, and I drove into town only to be told by the receptionist that my appointment had been for the previous week. I apologized, blamed my own carelessness, and drove home, turning the calendar over in my mind the whole way, certain, nearly certain, that I had written the date correctly. The second strange thing was smaller. My truck keys, which lived on a hook by the back door every day of my adult life, turned up instead in the kitchen drawer where I kept dish towels. I found them there on a Monday morning and stood in the kitchen a full minute, keys in hand, feeling something cold move through me that I did not yet have a name for. Laurel laughed it off the following Tuesday over coffee, in the easy tone of a woman reassuring an old man about nothing at all. "Dad, everybody misplaces things," she said. "You should see Gavin with his phone." Gavin, standing near the front window with his coffee, was not really listening to us. He was looking at the doorway between my living room and the dining room, the way a contractor looks at a wall he's already decided to knock down. He held one hand up, thumb and forefinger spread, citing the width of the opening the way I used to cite a fracture line before I trusted myself to call it structural. "You know," he said almost to himself, not quite to me. A house like this, opened up right, would be worth a fortune on this street. He said it lightly. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed saying lightly so many times that it no longer costs him anything to say it out loud. I laughed along with him because that was easier than asking why my son-in-law was measuring my walls with his eyes. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the appointment mix-up was my own fault, that the keys had simply slipped my mind, that grief plays tricks on an aging memory, and there was no shame in admitting it. Questioning my own daughter felt like a kind of betrayal I was not willing to commit. Not after everything I had already failed to give her when it mattered most. It was the following Wednesday morning, standing in my living room with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, that I noticed the mantel above the fireplace was missing something. Ruby's wristwatch, the one that had sat there untouched since the week I moved back into this house alone, was gone. I searched for that watch for 2 full days. I searched the way I used to search a debris field, in grids, methodically refusing to let frustration make me skip a square twice or miss one entirely. I checked the mantel again, though I already knew it wasn't there. I checked my own coat pockets, the junk drawer by the phone, the glove box of the truck, though I could not have told you why Ruby's wristwatch would end up in any of those places. I found it on the second evening in the kitchen in the drawer where I kept the potato peeler and a few mismatched serving spoons. A drawer I had not opened in months. A drawer I would have sworn on anything I owned that I had never once put that watch inside. I stood there a long time with it cupped in my palm, the crystal cool against my skin, and I told myself the obvious thing. Grief does strange things to a man's habits. I was 71 years old. People misplace objects. It does not mean anything is wrong with them. I put the watch back on the mantel, squared it carefully against the edge of the wood the way Ruby always kept it, and went to bed, telling myself the matter was closed. It was not closed. Over the following 2 weeks, small things kept slipping sideways, in ways that never quite added up to anything I could point to and call proof, and never quite stopped either. A hair appointment I had confirmed twice by phone turned out, according to the receptionist, to have never been booked at all. A prescription refill I was certain I had called in sat untouched at the pharmacy counter for 4 days past when I remembered picking it up. My reading glasses, which lived on the side table beside my chair every night of my life, turned up one morning balanced on the bathroom windowsill, a room I rarely used and never for reading. Each of these things taken alone was nothing. A tired old man, a full spring calendar, a house too big and too quiet for one person to keep perfect track of. I know exactly how that sounds because I said it to myself out loud more than once, standing in my own kitchen at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee I could not quite finish. Then the mail started thinning out. I noticed it first because the electric bill did not come when it should have on the second Tuesday of the month, the way it had come on the second Tuesday of every month for as long as I had lived in that house. I told myself it was a postal delay. Rural delivery ran slow this time of year, everyone said so. I let it go for a week. What I did not let go of, what I could not quite set down even after I tried, was a single sheet of paper that showed up folded into the bottom of a stack of catalogs and grocery flyers 10 days later. It was a notice from the bank, printed in the flat, indifferent language banks use for everything, informing me that a recurring automatic payment linked to my checking account had been canceled at my request. It did not name the service, it gave a date 3 weeks earlier. I had made no such request, and I could not for the life of me think what recurring payment it might have been referring to, because I did not remember setting one up in the first place. I read that notice 3 times standing at the kitchen counter, and then I folded it back into the stack of flyers exactly where I had found it, the way you fold a page back into a book you are not ready to finish reading yet. 10 days after that, on a Thursday evening at the end of April, the lights went out. Not a storm, not a tripped breaker, which I checked twice, flashlight in hand, standing in the dark of my own basement, at 71 years old, feeling for switches I had thrown 1,000 times without needing to see them. I called the utility company from my cell phone, sitting at the kitchen table by candlelight, and a patient young man on the other end informed me after a short hold that my account showed 2 missed payments and that service had been suspended according to standard policy. I told him that was not possible. I told him I wrote that check myself every month on the first of the month the way I had done for 30 years running, first with Ruby beside me at that same table and then alone. He was polite. He read me back the account history from his screen, 2 unpaid balances, 1 late notice mailed, 1 final notice mailed, service terminated per protocol, and none of it matched a single thing I remembered doing or failing to do. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at that table a long while in the dark, candle burning low, the refrigerator gone silent for the first time in years. Somewhere in that silence, underneath the confusion, something colder and more familiar was beginning to stir. The particular stillness that comes over a man in my old profession, the moment he stops believing in coincidence and starts believing in a pattern he simply has not found yet. I opened the household ledger by candlelight and turned to a blank page in the back the way I used to open a fresh incident report before the facts had settled into any particular shape. I drew 2 columns down the center of the page with a steady hand and wrote 2 headings at the top in careful block letters. What I remember. What actually happened. Then I went back through 5 weeks, 1 memory at a time, writing down every small thing that had not sat right, and beside each one, whatever fact I could pin against it. The hair appointment I remembered, confirming against the receptionist's certainty it had never been booked. The prescription I remembered calling in, against 4 unexplained days sitting untouched at the counter. The reading glasses on a windowsill I never used. The keys in a drawer that had never once held anything but dish towels in 30 years. The watch. The bill that never came. The letter about a payment I never authorized. The lights going dark over an account I had personally kept current every month of my adult life. By the time the candle had burned down to a stub, I had 11 separate entries in that second column, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, and together forming something I did not yet have proof of but could no longer honestly call coincidence. 11. In 5 weeks. I sat with that number a long time, the way you sit with a stress reading on a gauge that has started climbing and has not yet decided how high it intends to go. I told myself even then that there might still be an innocent explanation running underneath all of it. I wanted there to be one. Wanting something to be true and finding evidence that it is true are 2 entirely different disciplines, and I had spent 34 years teaching younger investigators never to confuse them. That night, sitting alone at my own kitchen table, I very nearly did. 2 days later, Heidi Little called and asked if she could stop by. She arrived with a manila envelope pressed to her chest and a look on her face I could not immediately place, somewhere between pleased and slightly puzzled. The look of a woman who has found something she thinks might interest a friend but isn't quite sure why. "They sent me the nicest little card," she said, settling into the chair across from mine at the kitchen table. "A free wellness checkup, if you can believe it. Comprehensive, they called it. I thought of you the second I saw it, Abner, because it's the very same doctor Gavin mentioned to me at the market, said he was wonderful with older patients, very thorough, very kind." She slid the card across the table. Cream cardstock gold lettering, a physician's name printed in a tidy, confident hand beneath a small embossed seal. Dr. Philip Hess. A complimentary comprehensive wellness evaluation, the card promised, for valued members of the community. No obligation whatsoever. I turned it over twice, the way I would have turned over a component pulled from wreckage, looking for a manufacturer's stamp, a serial number, anything that would tell me where it had actually come from, rather than where it claimed to have come from. There was nothing on the back at all, just cream cardstock blank. "Isn't that thoughtful?" Heidi said, watching my face, with the mild, hopeful expression of someone waiting for you to share her good mood. "I do think it's a lovely thing, companies still caring enough to check on us. Gavin's outfit really does seem to think of everything." I told her it was thoughtful indeed, because there was no version of that conversation where telling her the truth of what I was starting to suspect would have done either of us any good. I kept the card. I did not tell her why. Laurel raised the same subject herself that Thursday over coffee, in a tone so gentle it took me a moment to recognize it as pressure at all. She said she'd noticed I seemed a little more forgetful lately. Nothing serious, she was quick to add, just small things, the kind of small things that happen to everyone eventually. But wouldn't it set both our minds at ease if I just went in for a checkup, purely as a formality, purely so she could stop worrying every time she drove home from a visit? I looked at my daughter across that table and saw for one unguarded moment the frightened little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, absolutely certain her father could fix anything the sky decided to throw at us. I wanted more than I wanted almost anything else in that kitchen for this to be exactly what it looked like, a worried child, nothing more, nothing underneath. I told her I would go. I told myself I was doing it to put her mind at rest. What I did not tell either of us sitting there with my coffee going cold was that some quieter, colder part of me had already begun keeping a second ledger, entirely one with no columns at all, just a growing certainty that I needed proof of my own sanity before anyone else decided they had the right to take it from me. I made the appointment that same afternoon, thanked Laurel for her concern, and told myself I was simply putting her mind at rest. I had no idea walking into that clean, quiet office 2 weeks later that I was walking into the first courtroom of my life, and that the jury had already been paid for. Dr. Philip Hess kept an office that looked less like a place for sick people and more like a furniture showroom that had wandered in off the highway. White walls, white floors, a single orchid on the reception counter, positioned with the kind of precision that told me somebody dusted its leaves. He came out to greet me himself, which struck me as unusual for a man his age and standing, and shook my hand exactly once, firm and brief. The way you shake hands with someone you have already decided you will not need to remember. "Mr. Kelly," he said, glancing at a tablet in his other hand rather than at me. "Wonderful. Right this way." The examination itself took 11 minutes. I know this because I looked at the clock on his wall when I sat down, out of old habit, the way I have logged the start time of every meeting of consequence in my life since long before it occurred to me that this one might qualify. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, which I did without much trouble, though he seemed to be watching my hands more than listening to the numbers. He asked me to remember 3 words, apple, table, penny, and repeat them back after a short conversation about my sleep and my appetite, which I also managed without difficulty, though I noticed he wrote something down regardless. He asked what year it was, who the president was, what city I lived in. He asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether I sometimes felt confused about where I had put things around the house. I told him the truth. I said, yes, lately a few things had turned up in places I did not remember putting them. I said it plainly, the way you report a data point without editorializing about what it might mean, because that is the discipline I have practiced my entire career. You do not shape the reading to fit the conclusion you would prefer. What struck me only later, replaying the visit that evening in my own kitchen, was how precisely his questions echoed a conversation I'd had with Gavin 3 weeks earlier, standing in my own driveway, when my son-in-law had asked almost idly whether I ever found myself misplacing things lately. At the time, I had taken it for concern. Sitting in Dr. Hess's examination room, I heard the same question asked in the same order by a man I had met 11 minutes earlier, and something in my chest went very still and very cold. He shook my hand once more on the way out, told me his office would follow up with a full written evaluation, and turned back to his tablet before I had fully cleared the doorway. Then came the silence. 3 weeks passed with nothing. No call, no letter, no follow-up appointment scheduled the way the receptionist had promised on my way out. I told myself this was ordinary. Doctors were busy, paperwork moved slowly, a comprehensive evaluation likely required more time to compile than a man in my hurry expected. I filled those 3 weeks the way I had filled the 2 before them, coffee at 6, a walk to the mailbox an hour some evenings, with recordings I still had not brought myself to watch. But I have spent 34 years learning to distrust silence exactly as much as I distrust noise. An engine that runs too smoothly for too long is not a sign of good engineering. It is usually a sign that the failure hasn't announced itself yet. I found myself checking the mailbox twice some days instead of once, standing at the end of the driveway, a moment longer than the walk required, watching the empty road the way I used to watch a radar screen with nothing on it yet. 3 weeks of nothing at all is its own kind of evidence if you have spent your whole life reading absence the same way you read presence. It told me long before any letter arrived that whatever process had been set in motion inside that white orchid-scented office was not moving slowly. It was moving carefully. The envelope came on a Tuesday certified, requiring a signature I gave without reading a single line of what I was signing for, the way you sign for anything delivered to your own front door in your own name. It was heavier than I expected. 9 pages, I would learn later. Though I did not open it standing there in the doorway with the mail carrier's van still idling at the curb. I carried it into the study instead and set it on the desk unopened beside the leather contact book I hadn't touched in years and a framed photograph of Ruby I still could not look at directly for more than a few seconds at a time. I sat there a long while before I finally broke the seal, because some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years reading exactly this kind of silence before it turned into exactly this kind of envelope, already knew before a single page came out that nothing inside it was going to be good news. I broke the seal at my desk under the lamp, the same lamp Ruby used to read by on winter evenings, and I unfolded 9 pages of dense legal language that took me the better part of an hour to work through properly. I read slowly, the way I had trained myself to read any technical document that might later matter in a courtroom, twice through for content, a third time for anything I might have skimmed past the first 2. It was not a wellness evaluation. It was a clinical finding of cognitive impairment citing memory lapses, disorientation regarding personal finances, and a pattern of household neglect consistent with early-stage decline. 9 pages, and my name appeared perhaps a dozen times in the entire document. Everywhere else I was referred to by a single word repeated with the flat, bureaucratic patience of something designed to erase a man 1 clause at a time. The ward. I sat with that word longer than I sat with anything else on those 9 pages. 34 years I had walked into other people's worst days and been careful always to use their names, never a case number, never a file designation. Because I had learned early that the moment you stop using a person's name, you stop being obligated to see them as one. Somewhere in a white office with an orchid on the counter, a stranger had decided I no longer required a name of my own. Behind the medical evaluation sat a second document, shorter, colder, stamped with a county seal and a judge's signature. Deborah Harrison, District Court, Buncombe County, granting emergency temporary guardianship of my person and my finances to my daughter, Laurel Dillon, effective immediately, pending a full hearing to be scheduled at a later date. A third page listed the accounts affected, my checking account, my savings, the modest pension I had drawn every month since retirement. All of it, as of a date 11 days earlier, no longer strictly mine to touch without her signature alongside my own. A final cover letter, stapled almost as an afterthought, informed me that a formal referral had also been filed with Adult Protective Services, and that a caseworker named Jayla Connor had been assigned to confirm my welfare going forward. Somewhere in this county, a young woman I had never met now had a file with my name in it built entirely out of a document I had never been given the chance to contest. I set the pages down on the desk, squared their edges the way I square everything, and walked into the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I set it on the burner and watched the small blue ring of flame catch beneath it, the way I had watched 1,000 small mechanical things ignite exactly as designed, because a stove does not care what has just happened to the man standing in front of it. I took down a single cup, the plain white one Ruby always said looked like it belonged in a hospital rather than a kitchen, and I set it on the counter and waited. I did not call anyone. I did not sit down with a legal pad and start listing what needed to happen next, though every instinct built over 34 years was already quietly assembling a sequence in some back room of my mind, the way it always did whether I gave it permission or not. I simply stood at the counter and watched the kettle, and when it began to whistle, I poured the water and let the bag steep,
and carried the cup to the table and sat down across from the empty chair where Laurel used to sit on Tuesdays, bringing me soup that smelled like her mother. I did not drink it. I watched the steam rise and thin and finally stop altogether, watched the surface of the tea go still and then cold. And I did not say a single word out loud in that kitchen the entire time, not to myself, not to the empty chair, not to the small black light blinking patiently in the corner of the ceiling above the stove. There are moments a man does not narrate even to himself. That was one of mine. By the time the tea had gone fully cold, something in my chest had gone still in a different way than an hour earlier. Not shock anymore, but its opposite. The same stillness I have felt only a handful of times in my working life, standing over wreckage after the shouting stops, when the only honest work left is to stop asking why and start asking precisely how. I picked the cold tea up and poured it down the sink, rinsed the cup, and set it in the drying rack exactly where it belonged, because panic destroys evidence, and I had no intention of destroying anything else that week. Then I went back into the study, sat down at the desk, and read all 9 pages a fourth time, this time with a pencil in my hand. This time looking for something very specific, not sympathy, not an explanation, a seam. The place where a fabricated story, however carefully built, always shows the join between what actually happened and what someone needed the record to say happened. I noticed somewhere on that fourth reading that my hands were not shaking and had not been since I first opened the envelope. A man who has just lost his name to a stranger's paperwork should be shaking. I was not, and some part of me had been waiting for this longer than I wanted to admit. Every accident has a cause. I had spent 34 years proving that to skeptical juries and grieving families alike, and I had never once in all that time found a single crash that occurred for no reason at all. If what had landed on my desk that afternoon was an accident, then somewhere behind those 9 pages there was a design. And if there was a design, then somewhere behind that design, whether they knew it yet or not, the people who built it had left something behind. Every accident with a script leaves tracks. In my old line of work, we had a rule for exactly this kind of situation. When testimony and data disagree, you do not split the difference and call it a compromise. You pull the black box. I spent the better part of 2 days doing on paper what I had done 1,000 times before on other people's tragedies, laying out every fact I possessed on the surface of my desk in strict chronological order, refusing to let any single detail carry more weight than the timestamp attached to it. I used the household ledger as my primary record, the 2 columns I had drawn by candlelight weeks earlier, and I built out from there, cross-referencing bank notices, appointment confirmations, the certified letter, the 9 pages Dr. Hess had produced. Every scrap of paper the last 2 months had left in my hands. I worked the way I always worked, spreading pages across the desk instead of stacking them, because a stack hides relationships between documents that a flat surface will show you immediately if you're patient enough to look. I drew lines in pencil between related entries. I noted times wherever a time existed, dates wherever a date could be confirmed against something independent of memory, a receipt, a phone log, a postmark. What I found laid out flat under the desk lamp was not chaos. Chaos would almost have been a comfort. What I found was a pattern precise enough to have been drawn with a ruler. Every single anomaly, the missing watch, the phantom dental appointment, the misplaced keys, the canceled automatic payment, every strange small thing that had made me doubt my own mind over the past 2 months had occurred within a narrow window surrounding a Tuesday. Not most of them, not the majority, all 11, without a single exception, clustered around the one day of the week Laurel had chosen out of nowhere to start visiting again after 2 years of near silence. I sat back from the desk when I finished mapping it and stared at that pattern for a long time, the way you stare at a fracture surface once the metallurgy finally tells you exactly which direction the crack traveled and, more importantly, which direction it started from. It is one thing to suspect a stranger of a well-organized fraud. It is an entirely different discipline to suspect your own daughter of one, and to keep working the case anyway, methodically, without letting the sick feeling in your chest slow your hand.
I have investigated exactly one other event in my life with this particular quality of dread attached to it, and it happened in a kitchen 3 years ago, on a floor I still cannot look at directly without my breath catching somewhere behind my ribs. Which is precisely why I had spent 3 years avoiding the one piece of physical evidence in this entire house that could settle the question beyond any argument: the recordings. Every room, every hallway, every doorway in that house had been quietly gathering testimony for 1,147 days, encrypted, time-stamped, waiting in a cloud archive I had built with my own hands and had not once opened since the week I built it. I had told myself for 3 years that I simply hadn't needed to. The truth sitting there at my desk, with the pattern of 11 Tuesdays spread out in front of me, was considerably less flattering. I had been afraid, not of what Laurel might have done, of what I might see if I ever let myself watch the one day I had already spent 3 years refusing to relive. Opening that archive meant opening a door I had nailed shut the week I lost Ruby. It also meant now possibly the only way left to prove I had not lost my own mind along with her. 2 fears sitting on either side of a single login screen, and no honest way left to reach one without walking straight through the other. I sat in front of my laptop that evening for nearly an hour before I typed anything at all. The house was silent around me in the particular way it had been silent for 3 years, a silence I had built on purpose, and had never once until that night understood the full cost of. The login screen glowed patiently in the dark study, waiting, the cursor blinking in the password field with the same unhurried rhythm as the little black lights fixed in every room above me. The password was our wedding date. I had chosen it without thinking the week I set the whole system up because some part of me had wanted the one thing this house would never forget to be the one thing I never wanted to forget either. My hand hovered over the keyboard longer than I care to admit for a man who has spent his career refusing to flinch from difficult data. Somewhere behind that password sat 3 years of footage I had built specifically so I would never again be blindsided by a tragedy unfolding in a room I wasn't standing in. Somewhere behind it quite possibly sat the answer to whether my own daughter had spent the last 2 months quietly dismantling my mind on purpose. I typed the date. 8 digits the day Ruby and I stood in a small white church outside Hickory and promised each other things neither of us fully understood we were promising yet. My finger hung over the enter key for one long suspended moment, the cursor blinking, the small clock in the corner of the screen ticking forward 1 second at a time, patient as everything else in that house had already learned to be. The archive opened the way any well-built system opens, without ceremony, without resistance, as though it had simply been waiting the entire 3 years for someone to finally ask it a question. A folder tree unfolded down the left side of the screen, organized by month, then by day, then by room, and at the very top of the window, in small gray type, I had to lean forward to read clearly, a single line told me exactly how patient that waiting had been. 1,147 days of continuous footage. Every room, every hallway, every hour I had spent alone in that house since the week I built it, sitting in a cloud somewhere, indifferent to whether I ever came looking or not. My cursor drifted almost against my own intention toward a folder dated the 14th of September, 3 years earlier. My hand stopped an inch above the trackpad. I sat there a long moment, breathing slowly, and then I moved the cursor away from that date entirely, down the calendar, past that whole autumn into March. I told myself I was being strategic, that the Tuesdays mattered more right now than a single afternoon I already knew the ending of. That was true. It was also not the whole truth, and I have never been in the habit of lying to myself about the difference, even when the difference costs me something. I was not ready to watch that kitchen floor again. I might never be. What frightened me more than seeing Ruby one last time was the possibility of seeing myself arriving home 2 hours late, exactly as slow and exactly as unaware as Laurel had always believed I was, captured now in a format that could never be argued with or explained away. A camera does not know the difference between a man who was busy and a man who simply wasn't paying attention. It only knows what time he walked through the door. and I was not ready after 3 years to finally learn which one I had been. I clicked into March instead, and that was when the banner appeared. A red bar unfolded across the top of the screen, blunt and administrative, informing me that the payment method on file for this storage account had failed, that service had been operating on a grace period for several weeks already, and that all archived data, all 1,147 days of it, would be permanently and irreversibly deleted in 9 days unless payment was restored immediately. I sat back from the desk and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The automatic payment. The one the bank had notified me was canceled at my own request. A request I had never made. Whoever had reached into my finances to cut off an electric bill and a doctor's follow-up call had also, whether they understood what they were doing or not, reached directly into the one system standing between them and getting away with everything else. There was something close to admiration buried inside the cold I felt reading that banner, the specific admiration one investigator reserves for a mistake made by the very people trying to cover their tracks. They had tried to starve out a piece of paperwork. They had very nearly deleted the only witness in the house that could not be gaslit, threatened, or talked out of what it had seen. I did not sleep that night. I spent it instead at the desk, 2 external hard drives I kept in the study for exactly this kind of contingency running side by side, pulling the entire archive down in parallel, watching the progress bars crawl forward 1 percentage point at a time, while the little clock in the corner of the screen ticked past midnight and then well past it. Redundancy. Always redundancy. A man does not survive 34 years of reconstructing catastrophes by trusting a single copy of anything that matters. By the time the sun came up over the ridge behind the house, both drives held a complete verified copy of everything the cameras had ever recorded, time-stamped and hashed the way I had been trained to preserve evidence intended eventually to stand up in a courtroom. I drove into Asheville that same morning and paid the storage account current in cash at a service counter, watching the clerk's face for any flicker of curiosity about why a 71-year-old man wanted a receipt for a cloud subscription renewal. She gave none. I kept the receipt anyway, folded into my wallet behind Ruby's photograph, where I keep the things I intend never to lose again. That evening, back at the desk, with both drives backed up a second time onto a third, I finally allowed myself to open the first file inside the March folder. The footage came from the living room camera angled toward the fireplace mantel, time-stamped a Tuesday morning, 9:41. The same 9:41 that seemed to follow this family everywhere it went, as though the hour itself had chosen a side a long time before I had. Laurel stood alone in the frame, in the empty house, in a room she believed no one was watching. She was not moving toward the door. She was not glancing at her phone or checking the time the way a woman does when she is simply passing through. She was standing perfectly still in front of the mantel, looking down at something cupped in both hands, and she stayed exactly that way, unmoving for longer than any innocent errand could possibly explain. The timestamp in the corner of the frame read 9:41 on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in my study that night and watched my daughter stand alone in my living room for 17 seconds without moving a single muscle. She had come in through the front door with her own key, the way she always did on her visiting days, and she had gone straight to the mantel before I had even come downstairs that morning to greet her. She lifted Ruby's wristwatch off its place with both hands, the way you lift something you have been told is fragile, and then she simply stood there holding it, looking down at the face of it for 17 full seconds that the timestamp in the corner counted out with perfect, indifferent precision. I had expected, if I am honest, to see something closer to theft. A quick, guilty motion, a glance toward the doorway to be sure no one was coming. What I saw instead was a woman standing entirely still, turning her mother's watch over once in her hands, her shoulders dropping slightly, the way shoulders drop under a weight nobody else in the room can see. Whatever she felt in those 17 seconds, it was not nothing. I have spent my career learning to read hesitation the way other men read a confession, and what that footage showed me was hesitation, a woman doing something she had already decided to do and had not yet fully made peace with doing. I did not let that soften anything about what came next. It could not. I spent the following 3 nights working through 4 months of footage at double speed, the way I used to review flight data recorders, letting patterns surface out of the noise, rather than hunting for them one frame at a time. What emerged, compressed and undeniable, was a campaign carried out with the same patience I had once admired in my own daughter as a little girl, solving jigsaw puzzles at the kitchen table, working methodically, corner by corner, never in a hurry to see the whole picture at once. I watched her move my reading glasses to the bathroom windowsill on a Tuesday in March. I watched her slide an unopened bank notice out of the mail stack and into her handbag on a Tuesday in April, the same envelope I now understood that had reappeared days later, folded into a stack of catalogs exactly where I had eventually found it planted, not overlooked. I watched Gavin on a Tuesday I had not previously flagged sit across from her at my own kitchen table after I had gone up for my afternoon rest, laying out a calendar on his phone and tapping through it while he spoke in the low, patient voice of a man explaining a project timeline to someone slightly behind schedule. 3 months of documented pattern, he told her. That's what gets a judge comfortable moving fast. Any less we're arguing, any more we're wasting time we don't have. Laurel did not answer him right away. She sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring at a spot on the table that was not the calendar, and when she finally spoke, her voice came through the recording thinner than I had ever heard it, even thinner than it had sounded to me at her mother's funeral. "I'm not doing this because I don't love him," she said. "I'm doing this because somebody has to look after him, and I'm the only one who ever has." I sat with that sentence for a long time after the file ended, because I recognized something underneath it that I did not want to recognize: the shape of a story a person tells themselves so they can keep doing something they already know is wrong. I had built entire portions of my career around exactly that phenomenon, watching pilots, mechanics, and engineers explain away small deviations, right up until the deviations killed somebody. Nobody builds a catastrophe believing they are the villain of it. They build it believing all the way down that they are the only ones responsible enough to see it through. That did not make what she was doing forgivable. It made it in some ways harder to bear. I kept watching anyway. I watched the two of them plan, week after week, in my own kitchen, on my own furniture, while I slept upstairs believing my daughter had finally come home to me for the reason I had wanted so badly to believe. I watched Gavin coach her on which details to emphasize for Dr. Hess, which small failures to describe as patterns, and which real patterns to leave out entirely because they cut against the story they needed the record to tell. I watched the architecture of the entire scheme take shape one Tuesday at a time, methodical, patient, built by people who understood correctly that patience was the one thing an old man alone in a big house would never think to suspect. By the 4th night, something that had been grief for 3 straight years had finished cooling into something else entirely. I did not call Laurel. I did not drive to her house and demand an explanation across her own kitchen table, the way some part of me wanted to badly every single night that week. I have made exactly one mistake in this entire ordeal that I am willing to call a mistake outright, and it very nearly was that one. The impulse to confront, to make her look me in the eye and answer for what the footage had already answered for her, far more honestly than she ever would out loud. I chose the data instead. I chose to keep watching, keep cataloging, keep building a record no lawyer on earth could argue with, rather than hand them the one thing that might still let them cover their tracks: advance warning. Grief, it turns out, can be rebuilt into almost anything if you give it enough time and a clear enough set of facts to stand on. By the end of that week, mine had rebuilt itself into resolve. I set the household ledger down on the desk beside the laptop and opened it to the 2 columns I had drawn weeks earlier by candlelight. And for the first time since that night, I went through them, one entry at a time, against the footage instead of against my own doubt. The hair appointment. Confirmed on camera in my own voice on the date I remembered confirming it. The prescription I was certain I'd called in on camera at the exact hour I remembered calling it, the pharmacy's own hold music audible faintly in the background of the recording. The reading glasses on the windowsill. moved on camera by a hand that was not mine in a room I had not entered that entire week. The keys in the dish towel drawer, the watch, the bill that never came. Every single entry in that second column, the one I had labeled "What Actually Happened" with a kind of clinical humility 3 months ago, matched exactly what I had written in the first column, the one I had labeled "What I Remember," with far less confidence than it turned out I'd earned. 11 for 11. Not one lapse, not one moment of the confusion 9 pages of clinical language had described in careful, damning detail. I had not forgotten a single thing in 5 weeks. I had simply been the only person in the house who did not know he was being watched by the very people claiming he could no longer be trusted to watch himself. I closed the ledger and sat back in my chair. I did not do anything for a long while after that. I did not reach for the phone. I did not open a new document to start drafting a legal strategy, though every part of my training was already quietly in the background beginning to assemble one, whether I asked it to or not. I simply sat in that study in the lamp's small circle of light, with both hands flat on the closed cover of the ledger, and let something move through me that I had not let move through me in 3 years. I want to be honest about what that feeling was, because I have spent a career insisting on precision about exactly this kind of thing. It was not relief. Relief is what a man feels when a threat turns out to have been imaginary. This threat had been entirely real. What moved through me instead, sitting there with 11 confirmed entries staring up at me from a page I'd drawn by candlelight, was something closer to grief arriving late to its own funeral. The specific grief of realizing that for 5 weeks I had genuinely believed my own mind might be failing me, had lain awake more than one night, quietly rehearsing what it would feel like to lose myself the way I had once lost Ruby. Piece by piece, without any say in the matter. They had not simply tried to take my house. They had tried to convince me I was already disappearing. And for a handful of very dark nights in April, some part of me had believed them. There was one other thing sitting underneath all of it that night. One I did not say out loud to the empty room, any more than I said the rest of it, and I am not certain I would have found the words for it even if I had tried. 17 seconds. A woman standing alone at a mantel holding her mother's watch, unable to simply walk away from it, the way a person walks away from something that costs them nothing. I had spent 4 months learning exactly how far my daughter was willing to go against me. What that single piece of footage told me quietly underneath everything else was that some part of her had not wanted to go that far at all, and that I still loved her enough even now for that to be the detail that hurt the most. I let myself sit with all of it for as long as it took, which was longer than I care to specify, and I did not narrate any of it out loud, not to the empty room, not to the small black light blinking above the study door, not to Ruby's photograph watching from its frame on the desk. They used to, though for once that particular fact did not trouble me the way it might have a month earlier. I understood standing there exactly what I had and exactly what I did not yet have. I had proof of my own mind, complete, time-stamped, uncontestable. I did not yet have proof of theirs, not in a form any court in this county would be obligated to take seriously. Not yet. Not without a strategy built by someone who understood the exact shape of the fight I was about to walk into. They had a doctor's signature. They had a judge's order. They had, whether they fully understood it themselves or not, months of careful preparation behind them, built on the confident assumption that an old man, alone in a big house, would either never notice what was happening to him or would notice too late to matter. What they did not have, and had no reason to suspect existed, was 1,147 days of continuous, time-stamped, unimpeachable truth sitting quietly in a cloud archive built by a man who had spent 34 years turning exactly this kind of evidence into verdicts nobody could argue with afterward. They had a doctor, a judge's signature, and 4 months of careful staging. I had 1,147 days of the truth and 34 years of knowing precisely how to turn a black box into a conviction. Lennox Fisher's office sat on the 9th floor of a glass building in downtown Charlotte 2 hours east of my house, and she listened to me for exactly 4 minutes before she cut me off mid-sentence. "How many hours of footage?" she said. Not a question, really. A demand delivered flatly across a desk with nothing on it but a single legal pad and a pen she had not yet uncapped. I told her. 1,147 days continuous time-stamped backed up in triplicate. She set the pen down without ever having used it and looked at me for a long moment the way I imagine I used to look at a piece of recovered wreckage the instant I understood it was going to tell me exactly what I needed to know. Most guardianship cases I take, she said, I'm building a story out of scraps. Bank statements, a neighbor's memory, maybe a nurse willing to testify off the record. You're the first client in 11 years to walk in here with the entire crime recorded from 4 angles. She had taken this kind of case before, she told me, more than once, and she had a hard rule she did not break for anyone, regardless of how strong the evidence looked on the first pass. We would not surface a single frame of that footage before the permanent guardianship hearing. Not to Laurel, not to Gavin, not to Dr. Hess. Not even to Jayla Connor at Adult Protective Services, however sympathetic the woman might turn out to be. We would let them walk into that courtroom and swear an oath under penalty of perjury to a version of events the footage would then dismantle in real time in front of a judge with no warning and no chance to adjust their story once it started coming apart. Perjury is the nail, Lennox said. Everything else is just the hammer. That meant for the weeks remaining before the hearing, I had one job, and it was not a job my training had ever quite prepared me for. I had to keep being exactly the man they believed they had already beaten. I had interviewed enough pilots and mechanics over 34 years to know precisely what a convincing lie sounds like when a frightened person is trying to protect themselves. The small, over-rehearsed phrases, the eyes that go to the wrong place at the wrong moment, the willingness to agree just a little too readily with whatever version of events makes the conversation end sooner. I had spent a career learning to spot that performance in other people. Now I had to give one myself, and give it well enough that 2 people who had spent 4 months studying my every habit would not notice the difference. I practiced forgetting things I remembered perfectly. I let silences run a beat too long before answering simple questions. I let Laurel repeat herself twice on our next Tuesday visit without correcting her, watching the small flicker of satisfaction cross her face each time, and telling myself privately that every flicker was one more frame for the record I was building against her. It was on that same visit that Gavin mentioned the house. He brought it up gently over coffee, the way he brought up everything, framing it as a kindness rather than a decision already made without me. Long-term care, he said, the kind I might eventually need, did not come cheap, and the property represented the only asset substantial enough to cover it responsibly. He'd already had a few conversations, he said, with people who specialized in this exact situation, helping families transition a parent's belongings with dignity, nothing rushed, nothing careless. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the piano would likely go to a private buyer who specialized in restored instruments. Ruby's piano, he said, deserved better than sitting untouched in a house nobody was living in full-time anymore. I told him that sounded very thoughtful. I kept my hands perfectly still around my coffee cup while I said it. You don't need to worry about any of the details, Abner, Gavin said, reaching over to pat my shoulder on his way to the sink with his empty mug. We've got it handled. You just need to be there. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he does not know will turn out to be true in a way he never intended. He had no idea setting his cup in the sink that afternoon that he had just described almost word for word exactly what I intended to do on the morning his plan finally came due. Stand there, present, silent, and let the evidence do the part of the talking. He had never once imagined I was capable of doing myself. 2 weeks later, a text message arrived on my phone from a number I did not recognize, confirming a moving date and listing among the household items scheduled for what it called professional transition, a Steinway upright serial number included, valued for insurance purposes at just under $9,000. They set the date for the first Saturday in June. And that was the morning 6 moving trucks came up my driveway, the very same morning you already watched me stand on that porch and pack a single suitcase, calm, unhurried, giving away nothing at all. I had told you already how that Saturday morning began 6 trucks a suitcase, a judge's order I had never been permitted to see, coming. What I had not told you yet, because it did not belong to that first telling, was what the same morning looked like from the other side of the driveway, standing where I actually stood, with 3 weeks of quiet preparation sitting behind my calm, the way a keel sits below the waterline, invisible, doing all the actual work of keeping a man upright. Laurel arrived first that morning, ahead of the trucks, and she did not come to the porch right away. She stood by her car for a long moment, looking at the house rather than at me, and I noticed because I had spent 34 years noticing exactly this kind of small, involuntary thing, that her eyes moved across every window of that house except one. She would not look at the front room. She would not look toward the mantel even from 50 feet away. Even through glass, even though the watch had been sitting untouched in my desk drawer for weeks by then, safely out of anyone's reach but mine. A person does not avoid an empty space that carefully unless some part of them still remembers exactly what used to occupy it. I said nothing about that. I had learned by then precisely which observations to keep filed away for later and which ones cost more to voice than they were worth in the moment. Gavin arrived with the crew and installed himself at the center of the driveway the way he always did, clipboard in hand, calling out instructions with the easy confidence of a man overseeing a project rather than dismantling a life. He saved the piano for last, the way you save the centerpiece for last at any occasion, good or terrible, and I heard him tell 2 of the movers quite clearly to wrap it with extra care, because in his words, that one's worth more than the rest of this whole load combined. I stood on the porch with my suitcase and did not correct him on what exactly that piano was actually worth. It seemed a poor use of my remaining strength that morning, explaining sentiment to a man being paid by the hour to disregard it. It was one of the older movers, a broad-shouldered man with silver in his beard and a canvas tool belt worn soft from decades of other people's furniture, who found a reason to pause beside me on his way back down the porch steps for another load. He had been the one to shake his head almost imperceptibly the first time I told this part of the story. His name, I would learn within the next few minutes, was Memphis Lara, and he had been moving families in and out of houses across 3 counties for the better part of 40 years. He set down the box he was carrying my wife's china wrapped only in bubble plastic, the sight of which had bothered me more than almost anything else that morning, and leaned in close enough that his voice would not carry past the 2 of us. "Mr. Kelly," he said low and even, "I've been doing this a long time, long enough to know the paperwork on a job before I ever see it. This one's wrong." I asked him just as quietly what he meant. "Deposit came in on this job before any court order did," he said. "I seen the invoice myself. Company like ours don't usually get paid ahead of a judge signing off, not unless somebody's in an awful hurry to get started before anybody official has a chance to say no." He glanced once toward Gavin, still calling out instructions near the trucks, and then back at me. 40 years, a man learns the difference between packing up somebody who's ready to go and packing up somebody who still very much belongs where he's standing. "You're the second kind, sir. I don't much care for being part of a job that treats the second kind like the first." He pressed a small folded piece of paper into my hand as he bent to lift the box again, his body angled so the movement looked to anyone watching from the driveway like nothing more than an old man steadying himself against the porch rail. "That's my cell," he said. "Anything about this job don't sit right with you later, you call me. I keep records. 40 years I've learned to keep records." I closed my hand around the paper without looking at it, the way you close your hand around any piece of evidence you do not yet want to advertise you are holding, and I thanked him and told him I would remember it. I slipped it into my breast pocket next to nothing else of any value and buttoned the pocket shut before Gavin had a chance to glance our way. I had no way of knowing, yet standing there, with a suitcase in one hand and a stranger's phone number folded into the other, exactly how much that particular piece of paper was going to matter before this was over. I only knew the way I have always known these things, that a man does not hand you his number unless some part of him is already bracing to be called as a witness. Memphis found me again 20 minutes later on the far side of the last truck, where the angle of the vehicle blocked us from the driveway and everyone standing in it. He did not waste time on preamble. He pulled a folded sheet from the inside pocket of his work vest and pressed it into my hand, the same careful way he had passed me his phone number earlier. His body angled so the movement read to anyone glancing over like nothing more than an old man and a mover comparing notes on where a box should go. "Figured you ought to see this before it leaves the property," he said quietly. "Photographed it off the dispatch clipboard myself this morning before your daughter's people could tell me not to." It was an internal work order printed on gentle passage letterhead, the same soft gray logo I had seen stitched onto every polo shirt in my driveway that morning. Most of the sheet was routine pickup address item inventory standard handling notes, but halfway down the page, beside a line item reading Steinway upright serial number included, someone had typed a notation that did not belong in a document meant to accompany a man's belongings into storage on his behalf. "Private sale cash buyer confirmed. Do not include an estate inventory." Beneath that line sat a date, 11 days earlier. A full 9 days before Judge Harrison had ever signed an order permitting the sale of a single item from that house, let alone the sale of Ruby's piano, to a buyer who, according to the paperwork in my hand, had already paid for it in full. "That's not a mistake," Memphis said, watching my face rather than the paper. "A mistake looks different. This looks like a plan somebody wrote down because they were confident nobody with a reason to read it ever would." He nodded once toward the truck beside us, where two younger men were securing furniture pads around the piano's legs with the brisk, practiced indifference of men handling cargo rather than a life. "I photographed work orders like this off 3 other jobs this same outfit's run in the past year. Never said anything because it wasn't my business, and the families never asked. You're the first one who's asked, Mr. Kelly, even without asking out loud." I folded the sheet twice and slid it into my breast pocket beside his phone number, and I thanked him, in a voice I kept as level as I could manage, because there is a particular kind of fury that goes quiet rather than loud, and I have carried that kind my entire life. I walked back around the truck in time to watch 4 men lift the piano itself, guided by straps and careful hands, up the ramp and into the dark of the trailer. It had been Ruby's before it was ever anyone else's, a wedding gift from her own mother. The instrument Laurel had practiced scales on every evening of her childhood, while I sat 2 rooms away, more often than not working through paperwork from some other family's disaster, instead of listening the way I should have. I stopped walking when the piano disappeared into the trailer. Just for a moment. Long enough to feel the specific, precise weight of it, not grief exactly, not yet, but something colder and more useful than grief. The recognition that I was looking at a second piece of evidence, entirely independent of anything my cameras had ever recorded, existing on paper in an outsider's handwriting in a filing cabinet that belonged to no one in my family at all. I did not let that moment last. I made myself count it, catalog it, and set it down the exact discipline I had built a career teaching younger investigators at 100 different crash sites. You do not get to keep standing at the wreckage once you understand what it is telling you. You move. I picked up my suitcase and walked the rest of the way to my truck without looking back at that trailer even once. They believed watching me go that they had successfully cleared me out of that house. They believed the story was finished. An old man packed off quietly, a piano sold before anyone could question it, a fortune in real estate finally within reach after 4 careful months of patient staging. What none of them understood, standing in that driveway, congratulating themselves on a job well done, was that the house behind them had never once stopped listening, not for a single hour of the 4 months they had spent inside it, plotting how to take it from me. I spent that night in the guest room of an old NTSB colleague named Dwight, 2 counties over, a man who asked no questions beyond whether I needed anything and left it at that. The kind of decency I had almost forgotten still existed in people who owed me nothing. I did not sleep much. I lay in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, running the day back through my mind the way I ran every scene I had ever worked, looking for what I might have missed, and finding mostly that I had missed very little. What I did not yet know, lying there in the dark 2 counties from my own bed, was that the two of them, back in the kitchen they now believed belonged entirely to them, were about to say something out loud that neither camera nor courtroom would ever need embellishing, something they would come to regret with a completeness neither of them could have imagined that night sitting at my table, drinking what remained of a bottle of wine that had once belonged to Ruby, congratulating each other on how easily an old man had let himself be led out of his own life. I watched the footage the following evening back at Dwight's kitchen table with my laptop open and the volume turned low enough that it would not carry through the wall, and the timestamp in the corner read 9:14 at night, the same Saturday they moved me out of my own house. Laurel sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she used to bring soup on Tuesdays, the same table where I had signed nothing and lost everything anyway, and poured wine into 2 glasses from a bottle I recognized instantly by its label. Ruby's favorite. The one we kept for occasions worth marking, untouched in the pantry for 3 years because I had never once found an occasion since her death that felt worth marking anything with. Laurel had found one. She poured generously, the way you pour when you believe a celebration is finally safely underway. Gavin sat across from her with a glossy trifold brochure spread open on the table between them, Summit Pines Assisted Living, printed in soft green lettering across the top. A photograph of smiling elderly residents arranged around a sunlit dining room beneath it. He tapped a section of the brochure with one finger while he talked, the way he tapped everything he was proud of having arranged. "Memory care wing has an opening in 3 weeks," he said. "I already talked to Allison. She's holding it." A woman's voice answered him a moment later, tinny and slightly distorted, coming through the speaker of a phone lying flat on the table between the wine glasses. Allison Villarreal. I would learn her name was director of the very facility pictured in the brochure, her tone warm and practiced in the particular register people reserve for delivering good news about other people's parents. "We'll get him settled in beautifully," she said. "Doctor on staff can adjust the memory care protocol as needed once he's admitted. Little something to keep the transition smooth for everybody if he's resistant early on. Most of them are the first week or 2. It passes." Gavin laughed easy and unbothered, the laugh of a man discussing logistics rather than a human being. "He won't put up much of a fight," he said. "Between the guardianship and whatever the doctor wants to give him to keep him settled, he'll be about as much trouble as furniture." Laurel did not laugh with him. I watched her go still for half a second, wine glass halfway to her mouth, something crossing her face too quickly for the camera to hold on to, and then she set the glass down and reached for the phone instead, pulling it closer, lowering her voice slightly, even though there was no one left in that house to overhear her. "Just make sure it's not too much," she said. "I don't want him confused all the time. I want him comfortable." "Comfortable and compliant aren't different things, sweetheart," Villarreal said, warm as ever, entirely unbothered. "A light dose keeps him settled enough that he won't be fighting the transition, won't be calling lawyers, won't be making a scene at intake. Judge already ruled. This just keeps everyone's Tuesday a little easier, his included." Gavin reached across the table and flipped to the second page of the brochure, where a pricing sheet was laid out in the same soft green typeface as everything else. He ran his finger down a column of figures, found the line he wanted, and read it aloud with the flat satisfaction of a man closing a deal he had been chasing for months. "Preferred placement fee," he said, "goes straight to you once he's in the door, correct?" "Once he's admitted and settled," Villarreal confirmed. "Standard referral arrangement, handwritten on the invoice, not the system, keeps it clean on our end." I sat at Dwight's kitchen table, 100 miles from my own house, and watched 3 people I had never once considered capable of true cruelty discuss calmly over a bottle of my dead wife's favorite wine exactly how much money it was worth to keep a 71-year-old man sedated enough not to notice they were taking the rest of his life along with everything else they had already taken. They had a name for it, a light dose, as though there existed a version of that sentence gentle enough to make what it actually meant easier for any of them to live with. None of them sitting in my kitchen that night, drinking my wife's wine, discussing my chemistry like a line item on an invoice, understood that they were saying every word of it directly into the one witness in that house that could never be talked out of what it had heard. The camera above the stove, the small black light I had watched Roy level with his own hands 3 years earlier, sat exactly where it had always sat, indifferent and precise, recording 3 people confessing to a conspiracy the same way it had once recorded a woman standing alone at a mantel, unable to put down a dead man's watch. They believed they had finally cleared the last obstacle standing between them and everything they wanted. What they had actually done in that exact moment, without knowing it, was hand a federal prosecutor motive, intent, and premeditation delivered in their own voices, time-stamped in high fidelity, over the sound of a bottle of wine being poured a second time. I closed the laptop without finishing the recording. I did not need to hear the rest of it to understand precisely what I had just watched. I sat there in Dwight's borrowed kitchen a long while afterward, hands flat on the closed lid, not moving, not speaking, the small hum of his refrigerator the only sound in the room. And I let myself feel for exactly as long as I could afford to the full and complete weight of what it means to learn that your own daughter has priced out calmly the exact dosage required to make you disappear quietly enough not to inconvenience anyone. I did not slam the laptop shut. I did not raise my voice into the quiet of Dwight's guest room or wake a man who had already given me more kindness than I had any right to ask for. I closed the lid gently, the way you close anything you intend to open again later with a clear head. And I went downstairs to his kitchen in my stocking feet, careful on the unfamiliar stairs. I filled the kettle the way Ruby always filled it, 3/4 full, never to the top, because she said a kettle rushed to boiling loses something in the steeping that no amount of patience afterward can put back. I do not know if that was true in any way a chemist would recognize. I only know I have never once in 34 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood filled a kettle any other way. I took down 2 cups from Dwight's cabinet, plain white ones, nothing like the china that had left my house wrapped in bubble plastic that same morning, and I set them both on the counter side by side while the water came slowly up to a boil. I made 2 cups of tea. I have no explanation for this that would satisfy a rational man, and I did not attempt to construct one standing there at the counter. I simply could not make 1 cup that night. Some habits are not decisions. They are older than decision, worn so deep into the grain of a life that the hand moves through them long after the reason for them has left the room. I carried both cups to Dwight's small kitchen table and set one across from the chair I sat down in the empty space where no one was sitting, the way I have not set a second cup anywhere in 3 years without immediately catching myself and putting it away before the water even finished steeping. I did not catch myself that night. I let the second cup sit there, steam rising and thinning, and finally stopping exactly the way it had stopped once before at my own kitchen table, the night the guardianship papers arrived. I did not speak to the empty chair. I want to be precise about that because grief makes people say things about themselves in hindsight that were not quite true in the room. I did not talk to Ruby. I did not talk to Laurel, though some part of me understood distantly that this was as much about the daughter I still had as the wife I had lost. A girl who once insisted at 7 years old, standing on a kitchen stool, that her tea had to match her mother's exactly same cup, same amount of milk, or it did not count as tea at all. I only sat there in Dwight's borrowed kitchen with 2 cups going cold in front of me until both of them had gone entirely still, and then I rinsed them out, dried them, and set them back in the cabinet exactly where I had found them. Jayla Connor called the following morning on schedule for what she described as a routine welfare check required under her open file. She asked her questions gently, the way a person asks questions when they have been trained to expect fragility and have not yet had reason to doubt the file in front of them. Was I eating regularly? Was I sleeping? Did I understand the current guardianship arrangement and my rights within it? I answered each question plainly and honestly because I had decided somewhere between 2 cold cups of tea and a sleepless night in an unfamiliar bed that the truth itself would do more work in this conversation than any performance I might construct around it. Near the end of the call, I asked her a single question of my own, delivered as mildly as I could manage. "Miss Connor," I said, "in your experience, does your office ever look into who pays for the medical evaluation behind a guardianship petition? Not the doctor's fee schedule. Who actually writes the check? There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear her shift something on her desk papers, rustling a chair creaking under a change of weight. "That's not usually something we cross-reference," she said slowly. "Should it be?" I told her I couldn't say in good conscience that it shouldn't. I thanked her for her time, wished her a good afternoon, and ended the call before she could ask me to explain further, because a seed planted with too much explanation attached to it tends not to grow the way a seed left alone in good soil eventually will. I sat with the phone in my hand a long while after that call ended, watching the screen go dark, thinking about a young woman I had never met sitting somewhere in a county office with a growing itch in the back of her mind about a 9-page evaluation and an invoice she had never once thought to check. The permanent guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning, courtroom 3, Buncombe County. Laurel and Gavin would walk in believing they were there to collect the last remaining piece of everything they had spent 4 careful months building. I intended to walk in with a single USB drive in my breast pocket beside a mover's phone number and a photographed work order and 34 years of knowing exactly how to make a black box speak to people whose entire job was to sit and listen. Courtroom 3 in the Buncombe County Courthouse was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, the kind of room built decades before anyone imagined the sort of case that would eventually fill it. I sat beside Lennox Fisher at a table on the left side of the aisle, a single USB drive in my breast pocket, a mover's folded phone number beside it, and I did not once let my eyes drift toward the opposite table, where Laurel sat beside Gavin in a charcoal gray suit, chosen, I suspected, with exactly the same care he had once chosen his tone of voice for every conversation designed to sound like concern. Dr. Hess sat one row behind them, in a chair reserved for witnesses reviewing a printed copy of his own evaluation, as though he still believed its contents would hold. I noticed Jayla Connor before the bailiff called the room to order, seated in the row reserved for county personnel, a slim new folder resting on her knee that had not existed the last time we spoke. She caught my eye once briefly and did not smile, which told me more than a smile would have. Whatever question I had planted on that phone call, it had clearly grown into something she felt obligated to bring with her that morning. A man I did not recognize slipped into the back row just as Judge Harrison entered, unremarkable in a plain gray suit, the kind of man built to be forgotten by everyone in a room except the 2 or 3 people who understood exactly why he was there. I would learn his name only later. Special Agent Davion Vincent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crimes Division, present that morning at Lennox's quiet request, though nothing about his posture in that back row suggested he intended to announce himself before it mattered. Judge Deborah Harrison called the hearing to order with the flat, unhurried competence of a woman who had presided over 1,000 mornings exactly like this one and expected this to be another. She had signed the emergency order months earlier on the strength of 9 typed pages and a doctor's signature. Nothing in her expression that morning suggested she anticipated those 9 pages were about to fall apart in her own courtroom in front of her own bench. Laurel was called first. She stood, placed her hand on the Bible the bailiff extended, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in a voice that did not waver even slightly. She described under Gavin's attorney's careful questioning a father in gentle but unmistakable decline, missed appointments, misplaced belongings, a growing pattern of confusion she said had frightened her deeply as a daughter, with nowhere else to turn. She gave dates: March 14th, the missing watch; April 2nd, the canceled hair appointment; April 9th, the misplaced keys. She delivered each one with the composed, sorrowful precision of a woman who had rehearsed grief until it sounded exactly like fact. I sat perfectly still beside Lennox and let every single date land in the record exactly as spoken, because I already knew with a certainty no attorney's objection could have improved upon precisely what each of those timestamps was about to be measured against. 34 years of courtroom testimony had taught me the value of a witness who talks freely, unaware that every specific she offers is one more coordinate for someone else to plot later against a fixed and unforgiving truth.
Gavin testified next, describing the family's growing concern with the same fluent, reasonable cadence he had used at my own kitchen table for 4 straight months, explaining the guardianship not as a seizure of property, but as an act of love no reasonable person could fault him for performing. He mentioned the sale of certain household items as a necessary step toward funding long-term care, delivered with the mild regret of a man discussing an unfortunate but unavoidable expense. Dr. Hess followed, reciting the findings of his evaluation in the flat, credentialed language of a man who had given this exact testimony before in other courtrooms, for other families, and had never once been asked to defend the 11 minutes behind it. 3 witnesses. 3 oaths sworn on the same worn Bible. 3 separate accounts, each one internally consistent, each one delivered with enough composure to have convinced almost anyone in that gallery who had not spent the previous 4 months watching the true version of events unfold from 4 camera angles in 1,147 days of unbroken footage. I understood sitting there listening to each of them speak exactly what they believed they were doing. They believed they were closing the last open door. Each sworn word was in truth another timestamp they were nailing into the public record themselves under penalty of perjury in a courtroom with a certified transcript against a version of events I was about to prove beyond any argument a defense attorney could construct on short notice had never happened the way any of them just described it. When Dr. Hess finished his testimony and stepped down, Judge Harrison glanced toward our table and asked in the routine tone she likely used a dozen times a day whether the respondent's counsel had anything further to present. Lennox Fisher rose to her feet unhurried, straightened the single folder in front of her, and looked directly at the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "we would like to submit Exhibit 1. The courtroom's projector hummed to life, and a single frame filled the screen mounted beside the jury box. A living room I recognized instantly as my own. Time-stamped in small white numbers along the bottom edge, 9:41 in the morning, a Tuesday in March. Laurel appeared on screen exactly as I had first seen her on my own laptop weeks earlier, standing alone at the mantel, lifting Ruby's wristwatch from its place with both hands, holding it motionless for 17 unbroken seconds that Lennox let play out in full in real time in front of the entire courtroom without a single word of narration to soften what everyone was already watching for themselves. Then the footage cut forward, date by date, each clip labeled with the exact timestamp printed at the bottom corner of the frame. April 2nd, the same date Laurel had sworn under oath was when a hair appointment mysteriously vanished from her father's calendar, showing instead a woman quietly deleting a confirmation text from a phone that was not her father's. April 9th, the date of the missing keys, showing the same woman sliding a set of truck keys into a kitchen drawer that had never once in 30 years held anything but dish towels. I watched the color drain out of Judge Harrison's face as clip after clip rolled forward, each one landing precisely on a date she had heard sworn to under oath not 20 minutes earlier by the same woman now appearing on screen, doing the opposite of everything she had just described. She removed her reading glasses at one point, cleaned them slowly on the sleeve of her robe, and put them back on, the small unconscious gesture of a person trying to be certain her own eyes were not somehow at fault for what the rest of the room was seeing just as clearly. Dr. Hess stood halfway up from his chair before Lennox had even reached the 4th exhibit, requesting in a voice considerably less steady than the one he had used to deliver his testimony a brief recess to consult with counsel. Judge Harrison denied the request without looking up from the screen, which told me more clearly than anything else in that courtroom exactly how far her patience for this proceeding had already traveled. Lennox did not stop at the footage. She placed a second exhibit before the bench, a stack of 7 guardianship petitions filed across 3 counties over the past 14 months, each one built on a medical evaluation signed by Dr. Philip Hess, each one following the identical 11-minute examination window, the identical checklist of symptoms, the identical language describing early-stage cognitive decline in patients who in 6 of the 7 cases had never once been referred to a neurologist for confirmation. 7 families, Your Honor.
Lennox said, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. 7 evaluations. 1 physician paid in every documented instance, not by the patient or their insurance, but by the same company now standing to profit from each Guardianship Gentle Passage senior transitions. She called her final witness before the morning recess. Memphis Lara walked to the stand in the same work vest he had worn in my driveway, hands folded in front of him, and swore his oath with the plain, unhurried steadiness of a man who had never once in 40 years needed to raise his voice to be believed. He described the work order. The deposit received 11 days before any court had authorized a sale. The piano marked for private cash transfer off the books, off the estate inventory, off any record a family member might later think to request. I've moved a lot of families out of a lot of houses, Memphis said, looking not at Lennox but directly at the bench. Most of them the person leaving is ready to go one way or another. This one wasn't. A man knows the difference 40 years in whether anybody asks him to say so or not. Behind him, pinned to the lapel of Gavin's suit jacket, sat the small enameled pin I had seen him wear at every visit for months without once asking what it meant. A Regional Caregiving Association's Caregiver of the Year Award, presented, according to the engraving Lennox read aloud for the record, 8 months earlier, the same season the first of those 7 petitions had been filed. Lennox let that fact sit in the record a moment longer than she needed to, the way a good investigator lets a damning number simply hang in the air rather than underlining it, because a jury of 1 judge watching closely rarely needs the underline. I watched Gavin's composure begin to slip for the first time since I had known him, his jaw tightening, one hand gripping the edge of the defense table hard enough that his knuckles went pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Laurel did not watch the screen when the final clip began to play, the one from 9:41 that first Tuesday. Her own face, frozen mid-motion above her mother's watch. She had watched every other clip with the same rigid, unreadable composure she had worn through her own testimony. This one, she could not. I saw her turn her head away from the projection entirely, and for one long moment in that hushed and airless courtroom, she was not looking at the screen at all. She was looking at me. I did not look away from her. I have spent a career refusing to look away from difficult data, and I was not about to make an exception in a courtroom of all places for the one piece of evidence in this entire case that had never once shown up on any camera, the particular unguarded thing that passes between a father and a daughter in the single second before both of them understand completely and at last exactly what the other one has become. Whatever she was looking for on my face in that moment, I could not have told her what she found there because I was no longer entirely certain myself. Somewhere underneath 34 years of discipline, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through a summer thunderstorm was still very much present in that courtroom. And he was the one more than the investigator sitting beside him who found it hardest to hold her gaze without looking away. I looked away first. I want that recorded honestly, because I have tried throughout this telling to give you the precise sequence of events, rather than the version of myself I might prefer you to believe in. Laurel held my gaze across that courtroom for what felt like a long time, and was very likely only a handful of seconds, and it was I, not she, who finally broke it, dropping my eyes to the closed folder in front of me on the table, because I found in that particular moment that I could hold a federal agency's attention, a judge's scrutiny, and a courtroom full of strangers considerably more easily than I could hold my own daughter's stare while the last of what she used to be finished dissolving in front of both of us. Lennox let the silence in the room sit for exactly as long as it needed to. And then she moved to her final exhibit. "Your Honor," she said, "the court has now seen how the respondent's testimony compares to the documented record regarding his competence. We would like to play one additional recording captured on the same evening the movers vacated Mr. Kelly's property, which speaks directly to the petitioner's intentions going forward." The audio came through the courtroom speakers clean and unmistakable, Laurel's voice first asking Villarreal not to give me too much, wanting me comfortable rather than confused. And then Villarreal's own voice, warm and practiced, explaining that comfortable and compliant were not different things. That a light dose would keep me settled enough not to fight the transition, not to call lawyers, not to make a scene at intake. Then Gavin's voice, flat with satisfaction, asking whether the preferred placement fee would come to Villarreal once I was admitted and settled, and Villarreal confirming it would, handwritten on the invoice, rather than the system, to keep things clean on her end. The courtroom did not stay quiet for that one. A woman somewhere in the gallery gasped audibly. Someone else murmured something I could not make out, and the murmur spread low and fast across the rows behind me until Judge Harrison brought her gavel down once, then twice, then a third time hard enough that the sound cracked flat and sharp against the wood paneling before the room settled back into something resembling order. I did not turn around to see who had gasped. I sat perfectly still at the table, hands folded in front of me, and for a long moment after that gavel fell, I did not say anything at all. Because there is a particular kind of silence a man owes himself in the instant he hears played back in open court exactly how casually the people who share his blood had priced out the chemistry required to make him disappear. The stillness in that courtroom lasted only a few seconds by any clock on the wall. It felt considerably longer sitting inside it. Judge Harrison removed her glasses entirely this time and set them down on the bench in front of her, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of the flat procedural competence she had carried into the room that morning. "I have heard enough," she said. "This court's emergency order of guardianship granted in good faith on the strength of a fraudulent medical evaluation is hereby vacated, effective immediately. Full legal capacity and control of his person, his finances, and his property is restored to Mr. Abner Kelly as of this moment." She turned her attention next to the county clerk's table, instructing that the complete record of these proceedings, along with all exhibits entered this morning, be referred immediately to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges against Laurel, Gavin Dillon, and Dr. Philip Hess, including fraud, conspiracy, and elder exploitation under state statute. "And," she added, glancing toward the back of the room in a way that made it clear this part had not been spontaneous, "I have been informed that a representative of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is present in this courtroom today. Given the interstate financial elements this case appears to involve," every head in that gallery turned at once toward the back row, where the unremarkable man in the plain gray suit rose calmly to his feet, buttoned his jacket, and stepped into the center aisle without a trace of hurry, the way a man moves when he has known for some time exactly which moment was going to belong to him. I sat at that table and understood in the same instant everyone else in that room understood it, that I had won. Every fact I had gathered, every hour of footage, every folded scrap of paper Memphis Lara had pressed into my hand had converged into precisely the outcome I had spent 4 months quietly engineering. My name was my own again. My house was my own again. The truth patiently assembled and finally spoken aloud in a room built for exactly this purpose had done everything I asked of it. It did not feel the way I had imagined it would feel sitting in that quiet study weeks earlier, first understanding what my own daughter had done to me. I had expected something closer to triumph. What moved through me instead, watching Special Agent Vincent make his unhurried way toward the front of the courtroom, while Laurel sat frozen and pale at the opposite table, was the exact, precise weight of learning that the truth I had spent 4 months proving and the daughter I had spent 38 years loving had just in this single moment become permanently, irreversibly incompatible with one another. I had wanted justice for longer than I had let myself admit. I had never once, in all those months of quiet preparation, allowed myself to imagine what it would actually cost to finally have it. The recess following Judge Harrison's ruling lasted less than 10 minutes before it stopped feeling like a recess and started feeling like the second act of the same proceeding played out in the marble hallway instead of the courtroom. Special Agent Vincent moved first toward Gavin, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who had appeared seemingly from nowhere the moment the gallery began filing out. He identified himself formally, recited the charges in the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who has said the same words hundreds of times and never once found reason to rush them. Conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, in connection with the referral payments routed through Summit Pines, exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Gavin's face went the color of old paper. He looked for one brief moment exactly like a man watching a structure he had spent years reinforcing come down all at once, no longer able to locate a single beam still holding weight. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice cracking on the second word, all of the fluent, reasonable cadence he had used at my kitchen table for 4 straight months, finally, completely gone. "We were trying to help him. Everything we did because we love him." Nobody in that hallway answered him. The cold steel closed around his wrists with a single flat click, no dramatic ratcheting, no sound at all beyond that one small final mechanical note, and I found myself thinking, standing a few feet away with Lennox beside me, that it was a remarkably quiet sound for something that final. Dr. Hess did not resist. He stood very still while a second officer read him his rights, staring at a spot on the marble floor somewhere between his own shoes. The posture of a man already rehearsing in his head the version of this story he intended to tell his lawyer. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I found myself doing the arithmetic without meaning to. 11 minutes per patient, 7 documented families, a business model built on the simple wager that no one examined that closely would ever think to examine the examiner. I learned only later from Lennox that Allison Villarreal had been taken into custody that same afternoon at Summit Pines itself, in the middle of a tour she was giving to a prospective family, her explanation trailing off mid-sentence when 2 federal agents stepped through the lobby doors instead of the elderly couple she had been expecting. Laurel came toward me as they led Gavin away, moving fast across the hallway in a way that drew every remaining eye in the building. A courthouse deputy stepped half a pace to intercept her, and she stopped just short of him, close enough that I could see her hands were shaking, close enough that the woman standing there bore almost no resemblance to the composed figure who had sworn an oath on a Bible less than 2 hours earlier. "Daddy, please," she said, and her voice broke completely on the second word, the same voice that had once asked me to check under her bed for monsters. The same voice that had accused me at her mother's funeral of always being 2 hours away from the people who needed him. "Please, I never wanted. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You have to believe me." I stopped walking. I owed her, I thought, at least that much. One full stop, one last look before I let this door close the way it needed to close. Whatever remained of the father who used to check under her bed for monsters wanted badly to reach for her the way he always had. The rest of me, the part built over 34 years of learning not to flinch from what the data plainly showed, held that impulse very still. I did not raise my voice. I did not let it shake, though something in my chest was doing exactly that, quietly, beneath a composure I had spent 4 months teaching myself to maintain, regardless of what it cost. "In my line of work," I said, "when a plane goes down, nobody asks the wreckage to apologize. You don't get an explanation out of twisted metal. You get the truth because the truth is the only thing left standing that never lies to you." I looked at her a moment longer, at the mascara beginning to track down her face exactly the way it had at her mother's graveside 3 years earlier, and I let myself feel every ounce of what that resemblance cost me before I said the rest of it. "You wanted me gone quietly enough not to be an inconvenience. I gave you the truth instead. That's the only apology either of us is owed today, and it isn't mine to give." I turned and walked on down the hallway, past the deputy still holding his ground beside her, past a scattering of reporters already murmuring into phones near the courthouse doors, and I did not look back to see whether she was still watching me go. Near the far end of that hallway, seated alone on a wooden bench outside the courtroom doors, I passed Heidi Little, dressed for the occasion in her good church coat, hands folded in her lap, watching the whole scene unfold with the quiet, stricken stillness of a woman finally understanding exactly what kind of company her own good-hearted trust had kept her in for the better part of a year. She did not say anything to me as I passed. She simply nodded once, the small, weighted nod of someone who had just watched a debt get settled, on her behalf as much as mine. I nodded back and kept walking out through the tall courthouse doors and into the flat white light of an early July afternoon, carrying nothing with me but a single USB drive, a folded phone number, and for the first time in 4 months, the entire unencumbered truth of my own name. I drove home alone the 2-hour distance from Charlotte, collapsing down to a shorter stretch once I was back on the familiar roads outside Asheville. And by the time I turned up my own gravel driveway, the light had gone long and gold across the ridge behind the house, the particular color early July takes on right before it finally lets go of the day. A single-panel truck sat in the driveway where 6 trucks had once stood in a slow, deliberate line. 2 men in familiar gray polos were working at the edge of the lawn, and it took me a moment, easing my own truck to a stop behind theirs, to understand what I was watching. They were pulling the "For Sale" sign up out of the grass, working it loose from ground that had held it for the better part of a month. Careful in a way that struck me as almost apologetic, though neither of them said a word to me as I climbed out. Memphis Lara stood near the open back doors of the panel truck, overseeing a stack of boxes and furniture pads with the same unhurried authority he brought to everything. And when he saw me coming up the driveway, he set down the clipboard in his hands and simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, the kind of nod that carries an entire conversation inside it without requiring either man to say a single word aloud. I nodded back. Neither of us needed anything more than that. "Company's under new management as of about 4 hours ago," he said eventually, glancing toward the sign the 2 younger men were now carrying toward the truck bed. "Receivers already ordered everything returned. China, the good silver, all of it. Pianos coming separate from wherever that private buyer's got it stashed. That'll take a week or 2 to sort out through the courts, but it's coming." I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, though the words felt smaller than what I actually felt standing there. "Wasn't hard once somebody finally asked the right question," Memphis said. He looked at me a moment longer, the way a man looks at someone he has decided he respects without needing to say so directly. 40 years, Mr. Kelly, and this is maybe the 3rd time in my life the right person walked away with what actually belonged to him. I don't take much credit for it. I just don't much care for carrying a family's whole life out to a truck when the person standing in the doorway still very much belongs inside. He picked his clipboard back up and went back to work, because that, in the end, was simply the kind of man he was. I walked past him and up the porch steps past the small black light still blinking patiently in the corner of the ceiling, and let myself into the house for the first time in 5 weeks. Most of the rooms stood exactly as empty as they had been left the morning the trucks pulled away. Bare walls, pale rectangles on the wood floor where furniture had once stood. The specific hollow echo a house takes on when it has been asked to hold nothing for a while. The living room held only one thing, my suitcase, still packed, sitting exactly where I had set it down that first night at Dwight's. Then in the back of my truck, through every drive to Charlotte and back. Then, finally, here, carried in without a thought, the way you carry the one object that never once left your hand through an entire ordeal. I set it down in the center of the empty living room floor, in almost the exact spot where the piano used to sit, and I did not open it. I lowered myself onto the bare floor beside it instead, because there was no chair left in that room to sit in, and I did not particularly mind. I sat there a long while in the gathering dusk, hand resting flat on top of the unopened suitcase, listening to the sound of Memphis and his crew loading the last of the sign into their truck outside, then the engine turning over, then gravel under tires, then nothing at all. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that the way I have tried to be honest about everything else in this account, because I know some part of you listening to this story expects that moment to arrive somewhere around here, and it would make for a tidier ending if it did. It did not arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter, and in its own way considerably heavier, the specific settled stillness of a man who has just spent 4 months winning back everything he set out to win back, sitting alone in the wreckage of exactly what that victory cost him, with no one left in the house to tell about it, but the small black lights still patiently watching from every corner of every room. I thought sitting there of 34 years spent, walking into other people's worst days, and telling them with as much steadiness as I could manage precisely what the wreckage in front of them actually meant. I had never once in all that time had to sit inside my own findings afterward. I understood now, in a way no amount of professional distance could have prepared me for, that knowing the truth and living inside it are two very different disciplines, and that a man can master the first completely and still be entirely unprepared for the second. I sat there long after the light outside had gone from gold to gray to nearly nothing at all. One hand resting on a suitcase I still had not found the will to open, in a house that had finally completely become mine again. The wristwatch sat on the mantel again that night, exactly where it had always belonged. I turned the small brass key on its back for the first time in 3 years, and somewhere under the glass, a second hand began moving that had not moved since the week I lost her. Across the room in the corner above the doorway, I reached up and pressed a switch I had not touched since the day I installed it. The small black light blinked once, and then, for the first time in 3 years, it did not blink again. I used to believe that if I recorded enough, I would never lose anyone again. That a house wired closely enough to remember everything could stand between me and the particular helplessness of arriving somewhere 2 hours too late. I was not entirely wrong. The cameras gave me back my name, my house, my own good mind laid out in timestamps no court could argue with. What I understand now, sitting in a living room with one working watch and no working cameras, is that evidence can win you a house back. It has never once in the whole history of anyone's kitchen won you back a family. I think about the two people I loved most. One I lost to a silence in a kitchen, one I lost to a choice made in that same kitchen years later. God knows I have asked why a man who spent his life reading truth in wreckage could not read it faster in his own home. I have no answer, I trust, yet only a watch that runs again and a small prayer most evenings that God has not given up on my daughter the way the law has had to. I ask him most nights to keep her closer than I am able to. If it were you sitting on proof that someone you raised had planned to take everything from you, right down to your own name, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you do what I did and let the truth build itself quietly until it could not be argued with? I would like to know honestly in the comments below. If any part of this reached you tonight, stay close. There are more stories like this one still to tell, and I would be glad for the company.